Good evening and welcome to tonight's story on USA News Network. Good evening. I'm your host Nate Marcel, and tonight we'll be looking at the June 17, 2004 murders of 47-year-old Cheryl Williams and her mother 68-year-old Carol Barris, who were found stabbed to death in their trailer at 121 Vagabond Way in Altamonte Springs, Florida, just after 9 a.m. The boyfriend of Cheryl's daughter, Mark Van Sant, came to the house to pick up clothes for the daughter, Samantha Williams. Although the daughter had lived with the victims, she had left the night before at 1:20 a.m. with Mark and spent the night at his place, according to reports. The victims were known to be very friendly and had an open-door policy to their home. Cheryl Williams had been stabbed 129 times and bled to death. She was stabbed in the arms, legs, back, hands, feet, and chest, and had numerous defensive wounds on her hands that suggested an extremely violent struggle. Barris, who was partially paralyzed after suffering a stroke, was on the living room floor next to her wheelchair. She had been stabbed twice. The stab wounds were consistent with being caused by a 10-inch chef knife. Stemming from a gut-feeling tip from the daughter Samantha, police decided to question the neighbor Clemente Aguirre-Jarquin and his roommates. Clemente had entered the country illegally after fleeing Honduras because of threats to his life. He worked in a restaurant as a dishwasher. However, Clemente and his roommates said they knew nothing of the murders. Furthermore, the murder weapon, a kitchen knife, was discovered between the crime scene and Clemente's place of residence next door. The bloody knife police found resembled the knives used in the restaurant where Clemente worked, and the head chef informed police that the restaurant was missing a 10-inch knife matching its description. Later in the day, after being interviewed, Clemente came to the police to change his story. He claimed he had been drinking during the night of the murders and ran out of beer around 5 a.m. He went next door to ask for beer because he had a good relationship with the family, but when he went through the front door, he saw that Cheryl was dead in a pool of blood. He claimed to have tried to revive her, but to no avail. He then picked up the knife, fearing that the killer could still be inside the trailer. He then ran back to his home, dropping the knife along the way, and took a shower before bagging up his bloody clothes. He did not alert authorities because he feared he may be deported because of his illegal immigrant status. Clemente was arrested immediately for tampering with evidence at a crime scene. On June 25, 2004, Clemente was indicted on charges of first-degree murder and burglary. He went to trial in Seminole County Circuit Court in February 2006. Law enforcement officers, physicians, and crime lab analysts testified about the evidence at the crime scene and the victim's wounds. According to the testimony, the stab wounds were consistent with the knife found between the victim's residence and Clemente's home. The knife had Cheryl's blood on the handle, indicating Cheryl was killed first. Police also found 67 bloody shoe impressions, of which 64 were consistent with the shoes of Clemente. Law enforcement were granted a search warrant for the home of Clemente and recovered a plastic bag containing his underwear, socks, t-shirt, and shorts, all with traces of Cheryl's blood. A bloodstain pattern analyst testified that Clemente's shorts had contact stains on the front and back. The back had bloodstains that were the result of blood spatter, which the analyst said indicated that the blood was sprayed during the commission of the crime. The analyst said his socks also had bloodstains that were consistent with dropped blood. Additionally, a fingerprint examiner testified that she had correctly identified Aguirre's fingerprints on the knife. During trial, Samantha Williams testified that Clemente was banned from their home several months prior after awakening one night to find him hovering over her bed. She also testified she had spent the night of the murders with her boyfriend, Mark Van Sant, who similarly testified she had spent the night with him. Clemente later testified his story about trying to revive Cheryl by putting her body onto his lap. He said he then walked into the living room and found Barris' body where he saw the knife. Because he feared the killer was still inside the house, he picked it up and screamed, "Is anybody here?" He then checked Samantha's room and noticed it had been ransacked before he ran home. On February 28, 2006, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder and burglary. 2 weeks later, during the punishment phase, Clemente rose from his seat and yelled, "They're trying to kill me for no reason. I didn't do it. I didn't kill nobody." The jury voted 7-5 to impose the death penalty for the murder of Cheryl and 9-3 to impose the death penalty for Carol. Clemente Aguirre-Jarquin was sentenced to death. In 2007, after the work of fingerprint analyst Donna Burks came into question by her coworkers, Clemente filed a motion for a retrial based off this new evidence, but the Florida Supreme Court upheld his conviction and denied his motion. In 2011, Aguirre-Jarquin's attorneys asked the Innocence Project for help in seeking DNA testing of the more than 100 pieces of previously untested bloody evidence found at the scene. In 2013, they presented this evidence that Clemente was excluded as a source of the DNA, but rather found 8 samples of Samantha Williams that were consistent with her being the attacker. They also presented evidence of her mental illness and over 60 psychiatric evaluations. Furthermore, they brought forth a police recording of Samantha stating that the victims had, quote-unquote, died for me. Samantha also testified as having a violent temper and that she got in a heated argument with her mother just the night prior. Furthermore, a crime scene expert testified that what was believed to be blood spatter on Clemente's clothing was actually blood that had been transferred when he picked up the victims. Even with this evidence, he was still denied a motion for a new trial in 2013 by Judge Reckensider. While the appeal for his denial was underway, the defense continued to present evidence that Samantha had confessed to the crime on 4 other occasions, including individuals such as her neighbor and best friend. But it wasn't until 2016 that the Supreme Court overruled Judge Reckensider's decision and ordered a new trial. It was not long after jury selection began for this case that Judge Reckensider was removed from the case after conducting judicial malpractice in jury selection and demonstrating her bias against the defendant. Mark Van Saint's current wife, Nicole Bouzigard, came forward to testify. She contradicted her husband's previous testimony by stating on the night of the murders he noticed Samantha leave the house through a window only to return a time later. On November 5, 2018, while in the midst of jury selection, the prosecution dismissed all charges based on the new evidence that materially affected the credibility of their critical witness. In January 2019, his lawyers filed a petition to be declared a wrongfully convicted person, the first step to being compensated. According to the Victims of Wrongful Incarceration Compensation Act, passed by Florida legislation in 2008, each year a prisoner spends behind bars after being wrongfully incarcerated is rewarded $50,000, and therefore, after spending 12 years behind bars, Clemente is entitled to $600,000 as compensation.
When looking at the factors that led to his wrongful conviction, we must start with the targeted practices of the police. They engaged in what is known as tunnel vision. From the moment Samantha stated to the police she had a gut feeling Clemente did it, they were solely fixated on building evidence against Clemente, so much so that they failed to consider other suspects, including the daughter, in the investigation. If they would have looked into the daughter in any capacity, they would have discovered that she had a documented history of mental health issues and had been involuntarily committed to a hospital 3 times before the murder after threatening her mother. Also, the circumstantial evidence surrounding her alibi could have been more thoroughly examined. Race also played a role in his wrongful conviction. He is considered a member of the fringe population because he is a visible Honduran and thus not a part of the majority, which is a white demographic.
This makes him susceptible to being an unpopular defendant, which is a predisposing circumstance where the public, police, Crown, and jury come to see the accused in a negative light because of stereotypes of lawlessness about his demographic. An example of this is the fact that he was an illegal immigrant. They questioned his honesty and integrity of his story about the night of the murders because they believed all illegal immigrants were dishonest men who can't be trusted. And this is an element the Crown used to frame Clemente as a liar.
This status of being an unpopular defendant consistently leads to issues such as eyewitness misidentification, and as Clemente's case demonstrates, it increases the likelihood a defendant will receive the death penalty. Furthermore, when discussing race, we ask, why did law enforcement choose to believe Samantha Williams' story about him being banned over Clemente's story that he was welcome in the home. This is likely because of the structural organization of the justice system known as the wedge of injustice. Those higher on the wedge are those with the most power and have the authority to exercise their power against those more marginalized below them on the wedge. Thus, because Samantha fits the societal norm of being a white female, she is higher on the wedge than Clemente, who is a poor immigrant, and therefore she is more likely to be believed by the police. The next factor was the police mishandling the investigation. Investigators found over 100 bloodstains at the scene of the crime and ultimately chose not to analyze them against samples from Clemente at any point during the investigation. It wasn't until Clemente's attorney asked the Innocent Project for help in seeking DNA testing that it was discovered that these blood samples were not from Clemente, but rather were positive matches for Samantha Williams. So why did the police choose not to test these samples? In part, it could be due to the fact there was a high level of public pressure to solve the murders as quick as possible because these were vulnerable white females, and someone needs to be held accountable to help ease the public's mind and maintain confidence in law enforcement. This demonstrates how the criminal justice system values speed over accuracy. Another factor was his inadequate legal defense. Because he was an illegal immigrant with little money, he had a court-appointed attorney. Prior to the guilt phase, Clemente expressed his displeasure with his counsel due to the length of time to receive discovery, the length of time to go to trial, and his counsel's grim outlook on the chances of an acquittal at trial. At the original trial, his defense didn't request the DNA testing of the over 100 bloodstains found at the scene that was later used to exonerate Clemente. This mistake could be due to the fact court-appointed lawyers have heavy caseloads and are relatively inexperienced, leading to these mistakes. Clemente even attempted to fire his lawyer and represent himself by bringing these issues before the judge. However, the trial judge then asked counsel for explanation, of which they denied these accusations, and the judge found that counsel was adequately representing him and denied his motion. Clemente may have been able to avoid a guilty verdict if he had representation that believed they actually had a shot at winning, but instead, he was convinced into keeping his inadequate counsel by the trial judge. This highlights a structural level disadvantage towards minorities, because it suggests that the wrongful convictions are disproportionately found among minorities because they lack the political, legal, and economic resources to protect themselves. This case also highlights the use of falsified forensic evidence. Fingerprint examiner Donna Burke testified she had identified Aguirre's fingerprints on the knife. However, in 2007, a coworker reported that Burke's had made a positive identification on a print that was impossible to read. Her reasoning for doing this is what is known as noble cause corruption. Donna Burke viewed fabricating and improving the fingerprint results as a justifiable action to improve the evidence and thus bend the rules to help secure the Crown conviction against somebody she felt was guilty. This highlights an issue with forensic labs and how they should be independent from the police so they aren't susceptible to the same biases. There was also evidence of jury bias. One member of the jury stated that she was extremely in support of the death penalty, and she believed it to be appropriate for all first-degree murder convictions. Clemente and his representation appealed to the judge to have this juror removed, and he was wrongfully denied this because the juror then lied and altered her statement. She stated that she would explore all options before issuing the death penalty to ensure that she wasn't removed from the case. Another factor is judicial malpractice. It was Judge Jessica Reckensider who denied the motion for a new trial on 3 separate occasions. However, in 2016, the state Supreme Court embraced the arguments for a new trial Reckensider had previously rejected. She should have withdrawn herself from the case at this point when the justices overruled the way she had applied legal standards, but felt she was still compelled to stay on the case. The defense alleges she did so because she is convinced of Clemente's guilt
and had a vested interest in ensuring her ruling is not overturned. Additionally, Reconciler had allowed her state-mandated certificate to handle capital cases to lapse, and therefore being forced to ask for a waiver of extension on the deadline to complete her certificate. She should have disclosed this to the lawyers immediately, but did not because a new judge would have likely been appointed. Even after her decision was overruled and the search for a new jury began, she demonstrated judicial bias by informing potential jurors of the guilty plea Clemente once gave. It was after this she was removed from the case and a new judge was appointed. But why did she deny a new trial for so long? It could be due to Blacklock's power threat hypothesis, also known as the racial threat hypothesis. Because there is a growing minority ratio in the state of Florida, the action by the white judge could be seen as an attempt by the majority member to impose higher levels of social control on the subordinate race to help maintain the power and influence the dominant have over them. It could also be due to the structural issue of escalated commitment. Because the Crown had already committed so much time and effort into securing the conviction, Judge Reconciler was committed to show they didn't waste the court's time, taxpayers' dollars, or damage the faith the public had in the justice system by overruling a previous decision. Finally, this case highlights issues associated with the death penalty. With the rise of technology, you see a number of cases overturned because of new DNA evidence. However, you cannot correct a wrongful conviction if that person has already been executed. This would have meant that since 1973, 163 individuals who have been released from death row due to evidence proving their innocence would have been innocently murdered by the state for something they did not commit. Clemente himself likely received the death penalty in part because throughout his case he continually maintained his innocence. But this means by not acknowledging the criminal actions they are suspecting you of, you aren't demonstrating the remorse the courts require to lessen your sentence from death, essentially coercing innocent people on trial to give a false confession in order to save their own life. Furthermore, the execution sentence can have a brutalization effect on the general population. This means that having the death penalty actually increases the propensity to kill because it diminishes the public's respect for life, suggesting it actually has an opposite effect to deterrence, and you will actually see murder rates increase.